Imagine an entire civilization thriving in one of the driest places on Earth. A place where the sun can push temperatures past 50 degrees Celsius. A place where rain sometimes refuses to fall for years at a time. And yet, in this same place, a forgotten people built cities. They built underground water systems that stretched for hundreds of miles. They built a powerful kingdom that traded with Rome, fought wars, and controlled the desert for nearly 1,000 years. Then centuries later, almost everything they built was swallowed by the sand. Their cities crumbled. Their names faded from memory. And today, most people have never even heard of them. This is the story of the Garamantes, Africa's forgotten underground empire. For most of us, when we picture the Sahara, we picture nothing but sand. Endless dunes, cracked earth, and a horizon that never seems to end. We assume it has always been this way. A dead land. A place where nothing could ever survive, let alone thrive. But that assumption is wrong, and it has been wrong for thousands of years. The Sahara was not always the merciless furnace we know today. Long before any human civilization rose in that region, this land was green. Lakes covered parts of it, some large enough that you could not see across to the other shore. Rivers cut through valleys that are now dry riverbeds, hard to imagine when you look at satellite images of the region today. Grasslands stretched where there is now nothing but rock and dust, and hippos, crocodiles, and elephants once lived in places that today do not see a single drop of rain for years at a time. This period is sometimes called the African humid period, a time when monsoon rains reached deep into what is now the Sahara Desert. Wildlife roamed freely. Early humans hunted, fished, and settled along the shores of lakes that no longer exist, leaving behind rock art in places like the Tassili Plateau that still shows swimmers, cattle herders, and animals that could never survive there now. But that green Sahara did not last forever. Around 5,000 years ago, the rain stopped. The climate shifted, and slowly, relentlessly, the desert reclaimed the land. Most of the people who lived across this region had no choice but to retreat, moving toward the Nile, toward the coast, toward anywhere that still had water on the surface. The green Sahara died, and the vast, dry Sahara we recognize today was born. And yet, thousands of years after the rains had already stopped, one group of people did not retreat. Instead, they went underground. Literally. In the southwestern part of what is now Libya, in a region known as the Fezzan, a civilization began to take shape sometime around the first millennium before the Common Era. These were the Garamantes. Ancient Greek and Roman writers spoke of them, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with suspicion, often with a mixture of fear and fascination. For centuries, the story historians told about the Garamantes was a simple one. They were dismissed as desert nomads, wandering tribes, raiders who lived on the edge of the civilized world, useful only as a footnote in the history of Rome's African frontier. But that story turns out to be almost completely wrong. Modern archaeology, especially decades of careful excavation and survey work in the Fezzan region, has revealed something far more remarkable. The Garamantes were not a scattered, wandering people. They were farmers. They were engineers. They were city builders. They ran an urbanized society in the middle of one of the harshest environments on the planet, and they did it without a single permanent river. So how does a civilization survive, let alone flourish, in a place with almost no rainfall and no rivers at all? The answer lies beneath their feet, hidden in the rock itself. When the Sahara was still green, all that rainfall had to go somewhere. Much of it seeped down through the ground and became trapped in vast underground layers of rock known as aquifers. Over thousands of years, this water became sealed away, locked beneath the desert surface long after the rains above had stopped falling. Scientists call this fossil water because, unlike ordinary groundwater that gets refilled by rain year after year, this water was ancient. It had been building up since the humid period thousands of years earlier, and once the desert dried out, almost nothing was replenishing it. It was, in a sense, a savings account of water left behind by a lost climate. The Garamantes were drawing on groundwater that had accumulated during that earlier humid period and was not being meaningfully renewed. Somewhere along the base of a rocky escarpment near a valley called Wadi al-Ajal, the Garamantes discovered something extraordinary. In certain places, this ancient underground water sat at a level higher than the valley floor itself. That single detail changed everything. If water inside a hill sits higher than the land you want to irrigate, gravity does the rest of the work for you. You do not need pumps. You do not need machines. You simply need a way to dig a tunnel that slopes gently downward, connecting the water inside the rock to the fields and settlements below. And that is exactly what the Garamantes built. They engineered a system of underground channels known as fagaras, sometimes also called kanats, a technology that may have been inspired by irrigation methods already in use in Persia and Egypt. Garamantian engineers dug long underground channels to tap the water trapped in the aquifer at the base of the escarpment and carry it out into the valley, where it flowed continuously and turned the land into something like a garden. Picture this for a moment. Beneath the surface of one of the driest deserts on Earth, there existed a hidden network of tunnels, carrying fresh water silently through the dark, feeding fields and settlements that from above looked like nothing more than dry, hostile wasteland. It is almost poetic. The desert hides its cruelty on the surface, while underground, an entire civilization quietly engineers its own miracle. The scale of this achievement is genuinely difficult to comprehend. These narrow channels were often less than 2 feet wide and about 5 feet high, but some stretched for several miles, and in total roughly 600 of these fagaras extended for hundreds of miles beneath the ground. To dig and maintain a tunnel like this, workers could not simply crawl along blindly underground. The channels were dug and kept in working order using a series of vertical access shafts spaced roughly every 30 feet, around 100,000 shafts in total, typically about 30 feet deep, though some plunged as far as 130 feet. Think about that. 100,000 shafts, dug by hand, into sand, gravel, clay, and sometimes solid rock, under a sun that could scorch skin within minutes. Some estimates suggest that the entire fagara network required tens of thousands of years of combined human labor to construct, and even more to keep functioning year after year. This was not a small irrigation ditch. This was one of the great hidden engineering feats of the ancient world, built with nothing but hand tools, human muscle, and an intimate understanding of gravity and geology, centuries before anyone had access to modern surveying equipment. Different researchers have estimated the total length of these tunnels differently, some placing the network at several hundred miles, others suggesting it extended even further once every branch and offshoot is counted. But whatever the precise number, the conclusion is the same. This was infrastructure on a massive scale, built entirely underground, entirely by hand, in a landscape that should have made permanent settlement almost impossible. And this water did not just keep a few isolated wells alive. It transformed the Wadi al-Ajal Valley into fertile farmland. Date palms, grains, and other crops grew where nothing should have grown. Oases bloomed. And where there is reliable food and water in the middle of a desert, people gather, settle, and build. But here is the question worth sitting with for a moment. Digging one tunnel by hand is hard enough. Digging 600 of them, coordinating tens of thousands of shafts, keeping the whole system alive for generation after generation, in heat that can kill a careless person in hours, that is not just engineering. That is organization, planning, and willpower on a scale we rarely associate with a desert people. So who were the humans behind this, and how far did their ambition actually stretch? The answer is bigger than most people expect. That brings us to the heart of the Garamantian world, their capital city, known as Garama. For a long time, outside observers imagined this as little more than a large village, a modest desert outpost at best. But archaeological surveys over the past few decades, particularly extensive work led by researchers such as David Mattingly, painted a very different picture. Rather than a single small town with a handful of scattered villages, the Garamantes controlled roughly 8 major towns, several of which have now been carefully excavated, along with dozens of smaller but still significant settlements, evidence of a substantial and organized state. Garama itself functioned as the political and cultural heart of this civilization, a genuine urban center with structures, fortifications, and a population large enough to sustain trade, agriculture, and governance on a serious scale. At the height of their power, sometime around the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, the Garamantes are believed to have supported a population reaching into the tens of thousands, an extraordinary number for a society living almost entirely on mined groundwater in the middle of the Sahara. Garama was not an isolated bubble either. It sat along important trade routes connecting the interior of Africa with the Mediterranean world. Caravans crossed the desert linking Garama to Roman-controlled coastal cities in the north and to communities deeper in Africa to the south, carrying gold, ivory, exotic animals, and enslaved people taken through raiding southward, and glassware, wine, and oil flowing back the other way. Archaeological digs at Garamantian sites have turned up Roman pottery, glass fragments, and coins, physical proof that this desert kingdom was never cut off from the wider ancient world. It sat, quite literally, at the hinge point between two civilizations. This is exactly why the Garamantes appear again and again in the writings of Greek and Roman authors. To Rome, expanding across North Africa, they were an impossible-to-ignore neighbor, described with a strange mix of respect and disdain, sometimes as savage raiders beyond the edge of civilization, sometimes as a genuine political power capable of war and diplomacy. Herodotus had already written about a desert people fitting this description centuries earlier. Later, Rome launched military campaigns south into Garamantian territory, part punitive expedition, part attempt to secure trade routes through the Fazan, and that alone tells you something. Rome did not send armies after a tribe it considered irrelevant. So who exactly were these people? Not a single uniform group with one simple origin story. Greek and Roman writers sometimes describe the Garamantes as similar to the Berber peoples of North Africa, and at other times compared them to populations from sub-Saharan Africa. And the skeletal evidence recovered from Garamantian burial sites supports the idea that this was in fact a mixed population, much like the communities that still inhabit the central Sahara today. Sitting at the crossroads between the Mediterranean and the African interior for centuries, absorbing migration and culture from every direction, they were never going to be ethnically simple. They were a genuine Saharan crossroads civilization, and their organization went beyond farming and trade. Excavations have uncovered fortified structures, elaborate tombs, and sizable stone buildings across the Fazan, evidence of rulers, organized labor, and long-term planning. All of it built in the middle of a place most people today still imagine as empty and lifeless. It's also worth remembering that none of this happened quickly, and none of it happened by accident. The Garamantes did not stumble upon a working Fagara system in a single generation. This was knowledge passed down, refined, and expanded over centuries. Early channels were likely shorter and simpler, tapping water close to the surface where the aquifer was easiest to reach. As those shallow sources proved reliable, and as the population grew large enough to demand more food and more water, later generations pushed the system further, digging longer tunnels, sinking deeper shafts, and expanding the irrigated area around the valley. Each generation inherited a working system and made it a little bigger, a little more ambitious, a little more essential to daily survival. By the time the Garamantian state reached its peak, this network of tunnels was not a clever trick anymore. It was the entire backbone of their civilization, as fundamental to their existence as roads were to Rome or the Nile was to Egypt. For hundreds of years, this formula worked. Mine the ancient water, feed the oases, grow the population, trade with neighbors near and far, build cities, defend the territory when necessary, And for a civilization to sustain something like this for close to 1,000 years in one of the most hostile environments on the planet is nothing short of remarkable. But there is a hard truth embedded in the very foundation of Garamantian success, a truth that eventually caught up with them. The water they depended on was fossil water, ancient, sealed, and finite. It was not rain-fed groundwater that refilled year after year. Once it was drawn out, it was gone, and nothing above ground was putting it back. Every fagara, every well, every irrigated field was slowly withdrawing from a savings account that had been building for thousands of years, with almost no new deposits coming in. For a long time, this was not an urgent problem. The reserves were massive, and the aquifer levels near the surface of the escarpment were relatively easy to reach. But as centuries passed and extraction continued, the groundwater level inevitably began to drop. And when that happened, the fagara system, brilliant as it was, started to lose its advantage. Remember, fagaras only work efficiently because gravity pulls water downward from a higher point inside the rock to a lower point in the valley. As the water table sank lower and lower, some of the existing channels could no longer reach it. When groundwater levels dropped below the reach of the underground canal system, the Garamantes responded by driving hundreds of new wells into the Sahara to tap whatever lowered water level remained. This is an important detail because it shows the Garamantes were not simply passive victims of a changing environment. They fought back, they adapted, they dug deeper. They engineered new solutions to keep their civilization alive as the resource beneath them steadily dwindled. For a while, it worked well enough to sustain a population that some estimates place at around 50,000 people during the height of their power. But adaptation can only go so far when the underlying resource is not being replaced. Eventually, the wells themselves began reaching the limits of what the aquifer could offer. At the same time, environmental depletion was not happening in isolation. Political and economic pressures were building alongside it. As Roman power in North Africa eventually weakened and later transformed under new political forces sweeping across the region, the trade networks that had once brought wealth and goods flowing through Garama began to shift and destabilize. A kingdom built partly on its role as a crucial trade hub becomes vulnerable when the routes running through it change direction, when neighboring powers rise or fall, or when the flow of goods that once sustained its economy dries up alongside its literal water supply. It is a brutal kind of irony. The same land that had thrived because it sat between two worlds, the Mediterranean and Inner Africa, became exposed when the balance between those two worlds shifted. Try to picture what that slow decline must have actually felt like for the people living through it, generation after generation, without any of them fully realizing how the story would eventually end. A farmer in one generation might have noticed that a certain well needed to be dug a little deeper than his father's well. His children might have noticed that a nearby fagara, once reliable, now ran dry for a few weeks each year before flowing again. None of these signs would have looked like the end of the world. They would have looked like ordinary, manageable problems, the kind any farming community learns to solve. Dig a little deeper, build a new channel, move to a settlement slightly closer to a stronger water source. It is only when you zoom out, centuries later, with the benefit of archaeology and hydrology, that the pattern becomes visible as a long, irreversible slide rather than a series of solvable local problems. That is often how civilizational decline actually works. Not a single dramatic collapse that people see coming, but a slow accumulation of smaller strains that quietly erode the foundation until, one day, the whole structure can no longer hold. So the decline of the Garamantes was never caused by one single dramatic event. No sudden invasion wiping them off the map in a single battle. No single catastrophic drought that ended everything overnight. It was slower, quieter, and in many ways more haunting than that. It was the compounding weight of a finite water supply running lower year after year, combined with a changing political and economic landscape that no longer guaranteed the same trade advantages the Garamantes had once enjoyed. Little by little, the foundation that had supported an urbanized desert civilization for close to 1,000 years began to crack. By around the 6th century of the Common Era, the elaborate, thriving state the Garamantes had built was largely gone. Their once powerful civilization had all but disappeared, with only small settlements clustered around oases fed by wells managing to survive. The grand capital of Garama, once a bustling urban center connected to trade routes stretching across the ancient world, faded into ruins. The vast underground network of fagaras, without the constant maintenance that had kept them functioning for centuries, gradually silted up, collapsed, or simply went dry as the water they were built to carry retreated further and further out of reach. The desert, patient as ever, slowly reclaimed what human ingenuity had temporarily held back. And this is perhaps the most haunting part of the entire story. A civilization that had defied the Sahara for nearly a millennium, that had built cities, supported tens of thousands of people, engaged in diplomacy and warfare with Rome itself, and constructed one of the most impressive hidden engineering feats of the ancient world, simply faded from common memory. Unlike Rome, unlike Egypt, unlike so many other ancient civilizations whose names remain instantly recognizable today, the Garamantes slipped almost entirely out of popular historical consciousness. For centuries after their decline, most historians barely mention them beyond a passing reference as a peripheral desert people on the edge of Rome's African territories. It was only through decades of patient, painstaking archaeological work in the 20th and 21st centuries, surveys, excavations, satellite imaging, and careful analysis of ancient irrigation systems, that the true scale of what they achieved slowly came back into focus. Even the physical landscape conspired to hide their achievements. Because the fagaras were underground, because the mud brick structures of their settlements eroded and crumbled under centuries of wind and sand, because the desert itself is so good at burying evidence of human presence, there was nothing dramatic and visible left standing to remind later generations of what once existed here. No towering pyramids catching sunlight on the horizon. No enormous stone temples announcing themselves to travelers from miles away. Just quiet depressions in the sand marking old access shafts, and buried foundations waiting to be uncovered by archaeologists centuries later. It is almost as if the very method that allowed the Garamantes to survive the desert, going underground, working with the land rather than against it, also ensured that their legacy would remain hidden once they were gone. Think about that contrast for a second. Egypt built upward toward the sky, monuments designed specifically to be seen and remembered for thousands of years. The Garamantes built downward into secrecy, monuments designed only to be functional. One civilization built for memory, the other built for survival. And in a strange twist of fate, the civilization that built for survival actually survived longer in real, practical terms, close to 1,000 years of continuous life in one of the harshest environments on the planet. It just did not survive in our memory. It survived in the ground, waiting for us to dig it back up. So we return to that question, the one that makes this story so genuinely fascinating. How did a civilization survive, and for a remarkably long time even thrive, in a place where survival itself seemed nearly impossible? The answer is not luck. It is not myth. It is human ingenuity applied with extraordinary patience and precision. It is thousands of workers digging by hand through rock and sand, generation after generation, to reach water hidden deep beneath a hostile landscape. It is engineers understanding gravity and geology well enough to move water for miles without a single pump. It is a society organized enough to maintain an infrastructure project on a scale that would challenge even some modern engineering teams, sustained not for a few decades, but for close to 1,000 years. And it is also, in the end, a story about limits. Even the most brilliant human solution cannot outlast a resource that is not being replenished. Even the cleverest civilization can be undone when the ground beneath it, quite literally, runs dry. The story of the Garamantes deserves to be remembered, not as a footnote in Roman history, not as a vague mention of desert raiders on the edge of an empire, but as one of the great examples of human resilience against nature's harshest conditions. They took one of the most punishing environments on the planet, a place with almost no rainfall, brutal heat, and no permanent rivers, and they turned it into farmland, cities, and a kingdom that lasted for centuries. They traded with the ancient Mediterranean world, they fought wars, they built monuments, and they engineered a hidden underground water system that still leaves modern researchers in awe of what was achieved with nothing but hand tools and determination. And when their water eventually ran low, when the political world around them shifted, and when the desert slowly began reclaiming their cities, the Garamantes did not vanish because they were weak or careless or unprepared. They vanished because they had been living brilliantly and creatively on borrowed time from the very beginning, drawing on water that belonged to a wetter, greener Sahara that had disappeared thousands of years before their civilization was even born. In a strange way, the story of the Garamantes is not just a story about the ancient past. It is a quiet warning about any society that builds its future on a resource with an ending it refuses to plan for. The Sahara took back what it had lent them, and in doing so, it buried one of Africa's most remarkable forgotten civilizations, hidden underground, almost as completely as the tunnels the Garamantes once dug to survive. Next time someone tells you the desert has always been empty, remember Garama. Remember 600 tunnels running silently beneath the sand, 100,000 shafts dug by hand, and a kingdom that outlasted Rome's memory of caring about it. The Sahara does not just destroy history. Sometimes, for 1,000 years at a time, it hides it.